Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my most dominant friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I explore the extremely clever yet inexplicably underused method of dominance analysis, which offers a set of techniques for determining the relative importance of predictors in a regression model. Along the way, we also discuss giving compliments, looking tired, Indy versus F1, chicken paprikas, Gustav Holst, Fozzie Bear, not paying attention while recording, Lewis Hamilton pinups, Lando Calrissian, equation forts, being appallingly cool, making no sense at all, and magnums of champagne. We hope you enjoy this week's episode.
You know, I would really like to pay you a compliment this morning.
Wait, this is season 6. I don't know how many episodes. This is the first one?
No, let me finish. You interrupted me. But looking at you, I can't.
Huh. I mean, I get that a lot, but
no,
it is a bit of the pot calling the kettle black.
Whatever. If I may say so, you look tired. You're on sabbatical. What's going on? Did you have a late night or something?
I had a very late night.
I
don't care what people say. You are able to recognize emotions in other people.
Did you hear that? Did you hear that?
He's yelling out the door to his wife.
I'm able to recognize emotion.
Who's obviously not home because you would not have done that joke if she were upstairs.
We're cutting this, right?
Yes, indeed. I got about half the amount of sleep because I was up starting at 1 a.m. with my kid watching the Japanese Grand Prix for Formula One.
The Japanese Grand Prix is underway. We're racing to turn number 1.
I think I understood almost none of the words in that sentence.
So it's a typical recording session then for the two of us. Uh-huh. We have gotten addicted to Formula One racing. It started during the pandemic. There is this great show on Netflix, if any of you watch it, but it's called Drive to Survive. It is a documentary about Formula One racing. And I'm going to annoy like half of my own country. F1 is really the premier racing in the world, I think.
Okay.
If you're looking for something to watch, either for yourself or if you have kids, kind of want to get them involved, it is really, really great. They do it wonderfully. They follow all the characters. You start to learn the drivers. You start to learn the principles. It's really lovely.
We are very selfish, drivers in general. In Formula One, has to be always good characters and bad ones and heroes and anti-heroes. So I'm on the dark side.
So we started during the pandemic watching that, but then it kind of grew on its own, and now we watch the races live. I've got one kid back at home, and we watch sitting in the same room, but we'll pipe the other kid in so that we can watch online together. Mm-hmm. The problem is there are 24 races in a season, the vast majority of them which are on very discrepant parts of the globe. Uh-huh. This was the Japanese Grand Prix, and the lights out was 1 a.m. Eastern time.
And it's lights out and away we go!
And it was almost a 2-hour race.
Oh,
so
my
last
gosh.
night I went to bed at about 3 o'clock.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your commitment to this then.
We even have fantasy teams where we buy.
What?
Oh, it's amazing.
Oh my God.
Again, you guys, anybody out there, it really is a great parent-kid thing to do. It is great fun. It doesn't cost anything. You can go to the F1 app and you can do the fantasy. So there's no money involved at all, no real money. But you get a budget and then you get to hire drivers and you get to hire cars, and then there's all this very complicated point assessment in the fantasy team. And so I'm second right now in my family. My daughter is in last place, but only because she's in love with Lewis Hamilton. For those of you who know Lewis Hamilton, Hamilton's my hero. He's my favorite driver of all the drivers.
Lewis Hamilton is a 7-time champion of the world!
It's so important for kids out there to hopefully see this and know that don't listen to anybody that tells you you can't achieve something. extremely impossible.
His glory days are waning. So he had 7 consecutive world championships. That ties the record. He was 1 lap away from winning his 8th, and there was a very controversial call that allowed Max Verstappen to win.
Max Verstappen, for the first time ever, is champion of the world.
And it's still seen as this huge controversy.
I have a little familiarity with Indy racing. I have a little familiarity with NASCAR, having lived in the southern part of the United States for 4 years. To me, Formula One is just like a snobby version of NASCAR. Maybe I'm just really not getting it.
Yeah, you're not.
Okay.
The fun thing is you have endless arguments about who is the best driver.
Right.
Max Verstappen is seen as the best driver in the world currently.
Critical difference between Max and Lando. Max has a complete f*** you mentality.
No, don't give me that bull now. You guys give me the strategy, okay?
But he's also in the fastest car. A lot of people say, well, anybody in a Red Bull car would be at the front of the field. Mm-hmm. But this pivots us into a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, which is a team is just that, right? When you think about who's the greatest driver, is it Hamilton? Is it Verstappen? Is it Lando Norris? Well, what's the most important part of being the best driver? Is it a skilled driver? Is it the experience of the driver? Is it the car, right? That raw speed of the car. But where the heck does the car come from? Well, it's engineered, it's built, there's the pit crew, and then you have a whole management team that runs the track live in the race and has radio contact with the drivers, and there's all the strategizing. It is virtually impossible to say unambiguously Max Verstappen is the best driver in the world, because you ask yourself, what do you mean?
This takes me back to when you had that really nice example of you driving your dad's bug in the...
I am a professional racer.
That's right.
Oh, wait, I paid somebody to race. I think to be professional, you have to get paid to race. Okay. So that's different.
I remember in that story that you were racing against somebody else, but you had both, and I don't remember all the language, but you had both clocked in previous times that determined how much of a head start that you got. And I don't remember. It felt like
it was a very long
time, right? So there was some way to try to equate things so that at the end of the race, we were essentially taking the car out of the equation and we were trying to make it about the driver. Mm-hmm. In this, when you talk about all of the different contextual parts that are going on, there's the driver, but it's probably more than just the car.
Got to ask you about those great passes. First on Michael Schumacher going into 130R.
I knew he'd hit the brakes. You know, he has a wife and 2 kids at home.
Exactly, and that's part of the great fun of it, because then you can start to generalize it. So I came up to your house, you made me your grandmother's paprikas, which is one of my favorite dishes, to say, okay, can we rank order the importance of the ingredients in this recipe, right? Can we rank order a symphony? I'm a huge fan of Holst. He has a symphony called The Planets, and it's one of my favorites. All right, so we're going to code all the features of that and say, well, what is the rank ordering of the most important features of Gustav Holst's planets? All right, you can do all the dumb ones you want, which is mostly what I'm capable of doing.
Nicely done.
But think about, of all the things the teacher does throughout a day, what are the top 3 most important things a teacher can do to help a child in their reading? What are the most important components of a treatment for reducing depression? We can go on and on and on of trying to say, we've got this correlated system. We are interested in what is the unique effect of this dimension above and beyond all other effects? What's the joint effect of all the things together? And we're actually really, really good at that. What we're bad at is saying, of all my predictors in this system, this one is the most important. And it's followed then by this one, and it's followed by this one. And the danger is we think we can do that, but it turns out we're really, really bad at it.
We are. Just to clarify, by the way, if you asked my grandmother what the most important ingredient is in her chicken paprikas, it's love. That's the answer.
I would have said chicken.
I think the second thing beyond love that she would have said would be the paprika.
Chicken has got to come in at some point.
At some point.
Remind me, what's the name of the dish?
Chicken paprika?
There we go.
Yes.
So,
well, whatever. Okay, thank you. I deserved that. For those of you who listened to our episode about misheard lyrics, I gave Patrick so much crap about getting the lyrics wrong when it was the actual damn title of the song. I totally deserve that. So in the regression context, which miraculously this somehow all led us to.
Has it?
Yeah,
or are we just kind of wedging it in here?
Whatever. We can talk about Formula One and paprikas.
Actually, I would like to continue to talk about Formula One.
Oh, they touched and they collided! Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. What has happened there?
But if we're really going to go boring and talk about regression, please continue.
You said something that I think is spot on, and that is when we're asking the question about what is the most important variable, which is an incredibly reasonable question to ask. If you have a regression model, and it could be other flavors of regression model, it could be a logistic regression model, it could be count outcomes, it doesn't really matter. But let's just think about it from the perspective of a general linear model where you've got 3 predictors, right? Like predictors A, B, and C. Which one of those is the most important predictor? I can ask that question, but I don't really know how to answer it. As you said, we're really bad at that. If I had run a regression and someone said, well, which one of your predictors is the most important? I could give an answer like, well, variable A is the most strongly correlated with the outcome. And that's an answer.
Yeah, that's a bad answer. It's a start. I mean, what it does is if I give you information about X, does that tell you a little bit more about Y than you would have known without having X? So in that sense, yes, there is a relation between those two. But what if you have a second correlated X? Well, now is it the relation between X and Y ignoring the other predictor or above and beyond the other predictor? And now we're off to the races.
Yeah, that's true. It's messier, right? And I think part of the problem here is just the ambiguity of the word importance. Because when I answered by saying, well, we could look at the correlation, what I was sort of thinking is if we had to pick one and only one variable all by itself, picking the variable that has the highest zero-order relation with Y, there's some logic to it, but you're right. There is this context of the other variables. So I move into a multiple regression, as you have forced me to do, and I have beta weights, which is to say I'm already thinking about things in a standardized metric just so we could look at them in some kind of comparative way. How about if I just tell you the variable that has the biggest beta weight and say that that is the most important variable?
Okay, there are 2 things that bother me about it. First, it's pretty easy to show that you can take the largest standardized beta among a set of correlated predictors and drop that out of the equation and rerun it, drop every other variable out sequentially and rerun it and compare what has the greatest contribution to the multiple R squared. Having the largest beta is not always associated with the largest contribution to the multiple R squared, which is a little bit weird, but that can happen. But here's the other one, and this is a dirty little secret of multiple regression that we just sweep under the rug and pretend doesn't exist. What does that beta represent? A 1 standard deviation unit change in X is associated with a beta standard deviation unit change in Y, holding all other predictors constant. We love that. You and I both get up and do our Fozzie Bear waka waka waka, of how great this is. But here's the funny thing. We're working in a set of correlated predictors. Well, what does it mean that you have a 1 unit change on one predictor that is correlated with all the other predictors, but we're imposing that none of the other predictors change?
Yeah.
Well, that's not a holistic reflection of the set of correlated predictors. You would assume that as one predictor moves in some way, it's going to pull those other predictors along with it.
Yeah.
It's a bit of this odd, contrived situation where we're almost treating it as if the predictors are uncorrelated with one another by trying to isolate these unique relations, when in reality, that's not the case.
So what I heard you say, first of all, is that you don't like my suggestion of using a correlation as a measure of importance for a variable. You don't like the suggestion of using a beta, and you actually snuck 2 reasons in there. One is this interpretational reason that the idea of just changing keeping a variable while holding all the others constant is this fiction that we can't really do. And I get that. You also snuck in another thing, which was the delta R squared, the change in R squared associated with a particular variable. You said something like you could have a variable with the biggest beta that might not have the biggest change in R squared. And that makes me think that somehow the great arbiter of importance for you is the change in explained variance that a variable brings above and beyond the other things. Is that how you would characterize importance then, a delta R squared?
I'm sorry, that whole time you were talking, I was watching on my phone. They're doing time trials for the Grand Prix in Bahrain, and I'm not kidding. They're live right now, and I have it on my phone.
Hello everyone, it is time for Formula One qualifying and we are under the floodlights of Bahrain International Circuit.
Is this a bad time for you?
I would turn it back to you and say, you're making a really important point here. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
You just dissertation defensed me. You didn't read the document and you said something so generic.
I'd like to hear more about that, please.
Fine. Who's winning, Patrick? Who's winning?
Not Lewis Hamilton, I'll tell you that. He's killing me. But please, you were prattling on about something related to R squared or something. I don't know.
Far less important. You had alluded to delta R squared as somehow being this measure of how important a variable is, how much a variable can contribute above and beyond the others. Now that you're paying attention, I will turn it back to you and say, do you like that then as the measure of importance? Do you think that that's a really good way to quantify which of these variables is the most important?
My favorite effect size measure is a squared semi-partial correlation.
Okay.
We have a whole episode on these partial measures and pros and cons, and so if you're a glutton for punishment, you can go track that down. Remember that there are 4 general ways that we can scale the effect of a predictor, and they're all exactly the same. They're just in different metrics. So it's kind of the equivalent of having inches, feet, centimeters, yards. But there's the raw coefficient, there's the standardized coefficient, there's the squared partial correlation, and there's the squared semi-partial correlation. Mm-hmm. There's not one that, relatively speaking, is larger or smaller than another. They're just different metrics. Let's say you have a predictor X that has a squared semi-partial of 0.025. You can say, of the total variability observed in the outcome variable, approximately 2.5% can be attributed to variable X above and beyond all the other predictors. Mm-hmm. I really like that. There is a siren song of saying, well, you could just rank order by squared semi-partial correlations, and the biggest one is the most important, then the next, then the next, then the next. But the problem is that's actually only one squared semi-partial correlation out of a whole host of them that you could compute. That's a squared semi-partial of that predictor above and beyond all other predictors. But I got a hankering to start thinking about, well, could we make some kind of combinatorial out of that? What is a squared semi-partial above and beyond X1? Mm-hmm. And X1 and X2, and X1 and X2 and X3, and trying to combine them in some way. And here's where I'll turn back to you.
Everything that you just said, I think, makes a lot of sense, because the contribution of a variable above and beyond the others is not the only way that a variable contributes. There's this method called dominance analysis that I like a lot. And dominance analysis was something I think that was put forth initially by David Budescu in the early 90s, I'm thinking, like 93. I think it kind of sat there, and then 10 years later, there was a refinement on it in Psych Methods around 2003. I'm pretty sure about that one. And that was by Ozan and Budescu. And that really laid the foundation for a way to think about what variable dominates relative to others, which is where the term dominance analysis comes from. And it draws on some of the very ideas that you're talking about. And that is, even when we have a whole system of variables, we can talk about the contribution of a variable, not just above and beyond all of the others simultaneously, but under all different combinations of that variable's role among the variables in that system.
This is also very much a practical kind of thing. A lot of times quant can be this saddle in search of a horse, which is I figured out this tiny little problem that nobody really cares about. This is a clear and present desire in what we want to do in everything that we have. We have a correlated set of predictors. We want to know what is the unique contribution, what is the joint contribution, and then in a principled and thoughtful way, can we rank order those in some way and saying, this is the most important contributor, and then this one, and then this one?
Well, it's tricky as hell if you think about it from the perspective of our good old friend, the Venn diagram. And the Venn diagram is the way we explain a lot of things about regression. And when you talk about the squared semi-partial or the delta R squared, right, we think about those areas that are above and beyond that shared piece. But then we say, well, wait a minute, who gets credit for the shared piece? Because they're kind of both able to explain that part. It feels like an irreconcilable problem to be able to say, well, one variable is more, quote, important than another. And Budescu framed this in a very interesting way that has two components to it. One is this head-to-head competition between variables. Does variable A dominate variable B? Or does variable C dominate variable A, right? We could ask those pairwise kind of questions, just like we could ask a question about, is, I'm probably going to screw this up, Max Verstappen a better driver than, was it Lando Calrissian?
Oh, for the love of...
I'm close, right?
Not remotely.
Okay.
I mean, there's a Lando, but you pulled in a Star Trek character.
Star Wars.
Wow, he says with self-righteous indignation.
I can't believe you got that wrong.
Welcome, I'm Lando Calrissian. I'm the administrator of this facility. And who might you be?
Right now, the world is trying to puzzle through Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, and Oscar Piastri.
And Lando Norris, who found the barriers, but it's over to Max Verstappen, has done it at the last by 1,000th of a second.
But never count out Lewis Hamilton.
Have you seen those abs? Dear God.
Yeah, every morning in the mirror. Okay. Because I have a picture of Lewis taped
to the mirror
in my bathroom.
Sure.
That's why it's like looking in the mirror.
So as I said, right, there are two types of questions we could ask. One is the head-to-head, which variable is better than another variable? We could also ask the question more broadly the way that you talked about it, and that is overall, which variable is the most important by some criterion? Which is the next? Which is the next? And he tackled both of these, and it revolves around this notion of dominance. Here's an example to think about it, and then we'll turn it back into regression. Imagine I had a bunch of different cities, and I asked the question, which city is hotter, right? It sounds like a really simple question. And there are many different cities. We could pick Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Boulder, Colorado, and ask which one of those is hotter. It sounds like that's a very straightforward question, but just like the word importance, it depends on what you mean by hotter. One way to do it, at any given day throughout a year, which city is hotter? Or we could take an average across the entire year and say, oh, this city is hotter than that. We could do it monthly and say which city is hotter on average in January and February and March. And then we could go through it like that. So there are a lot of different ways to try to operationalize what we mean by hotter. And in the same way, there are a lot of different ways that we try to operationalize importance.
As with many things, we can build a little fort out of equations and hide behind it and peek out over the parapet and say, look at me, I'm so smart, I have all of these equations. And really, one of the biggest challenges in this is, well, what the hell do you mean by most important? If you dig into a lot of the papers written on this, a lot of the authors, that is a first and foremost thing. And one even notes, it is more important to determine what you mean by importance than to calculate what that is.
Yeah.
As Greg is saying, is it the hottest day of the year? Is it the hottest average month? Is it the hottest average over all the months? Well, those are equally defensible. One of the big things is which is faster, Indy racing or F1? Well, there actually was an accidental experiment where they had an Indy race at a given track and an F1 race at a given track. So they controlled for the track. They both were faster. And well, how the hell does that mean? Well, Indy cars have a faster maximum speed, like all out on the straightaway. Indy cars are faster than F1, but F1 completed the lap faster. And the reason is F1 cars are built for cornering, right? As a lot of times Indy are on a big oval track.
Right.
F1, half the races are street circuit. Miami, Las Vegas, Monaco. And so they're built for cornering.
The thing's like on rails. So when you're doing 180 miles an hour and you turn, the thing turns.
Which is faster? Well, they both are. It depends how you define it. So that means that the number one thing we got to figure out is what the hell do you mean by important?
In the end, I don't have a single definition of what it means for one variable to be more important than another, or in the language of Budescu, one variable to dominate another. But he offers three different ways of looking at it, not unlike the way we talked about one city being hotter than another. One way to think about it, if we ran all possible models, if we had, let's say, 3 predictors, and you think of all the different possible models we could run a model that has each predictor by itself. There would be 3 of those. We could imagine a model where there are 2 predictors in each of them. There would be 3 of those. And then there would be one model where there's all 3 predictors. So in the end, for 3 predictors, there would be a total of 7 possible models that we could run. For p variables, more generally, it's 2 to the p minus 1 possible models that we could have, which for 3 predictors isn't that big a deal. If you have a couple more variables, it gets out of hand pretty quick. If you had 5 variables, 2 to the 5 minus 1. Okay, that's not so bad. That would be 31. If you had 10 variables, and I will tell you, I see 10 variable regressions fairly often, and that would be 2 to the 10th power minus 1, 1,023 possible submodels. But imagine that you could run all of those models. One way we could define a variable dominating over another would be something that could be called complete dominance. Let's imagine we're interested in variables A and B. If we went to the models that have A and B in it, it wouldn't just be a model with A and B, it would be a model with A, B, and C, and if there are more variables. And we could ask which variable has the greatest marginal contribution. And if in every single one of those circumstances where we had variables A and B, A was contributing more than B, then we would say that A has complete dominance over B. That is to say, in all the contexts in which they both appear, there is one that is the complete winner. That is a definition of complete dominance, and it is one way to define the importance of a variable relative to another. Another is to look at all of the models that involve one predictor, look at all of the models that involve 2 predictors, look at all of the models that involve 3 predictors, and then if you had more, all of those. And then asking within those strata, like let's just take the one predictor model. There's a model that just has variable A. What's the R squared for that? There's a model that just has variable B. What's the R squared for that? And we could ask, all right, in the one variable models, who wins? It would just be the variable that has a higher R squared. Then we go to the 2 variable models. There are multiple 2 variable models that have A in it. In the example I gave you, it would be a model with A and B and a model with A and C. There are multiple models with the variable B in it. It's a model with A and B and a model with B and C. We could ask in each of those models, what is the squared semi-partial? What is the delta R squared associated with variable A in all of those 2 variable models? What are the delta R squared values for all of the models that have B in it? And we could take an average of those and we could say, for the 2 variable models, A is dominant, at least for that condition, right? If it has an average higher delta R squared for all of those. And then we could do it for all the 3 variable models. Well, there's only one 3 variable model in this example, right? So it would just be which one has the higher delta R squared in that 3 variable model. But you could imagine if there had been more variables, there would be more things to average over. And now if we said, is there a variable that is dominant in the 1 variable models and dominant in the 2 variable models and dominant in the 3 variable model, etc.? If there is a variable that dominates another in all of those strata, then we would say that that variable is conditionally dominant over another variable.
The strategy is completely defensible. It's completely face valid, but it just pivots around a different definition of what you mean by dominant.
Yep.
Same sample, same variables, same dependent variable. So that's part of the fun of this. Well, which one is better, complete or conditional? They're just different.
And we could do another one still, right? We could say, well, rather than just taking taking all of those different strata of 1 variable model, 2 variable model, 3 variable model, and so forth, we could just say, I've got an average delta R squared in the 1 variable models for variable A. I've got an average delta R squared for the 2 variable models. I've got an average delta R squared for the 3 variable models. If you just averaged those averages for a given variable, we would get an index called general dominance. So it wouldn't be dominant by specific numbers of variables. It would just be, on average, your delta R squared is higher for variable A than it is for variable B. And so we would say A is generally dominant over variable B.
And I got to tell you, I kind of got a hankering for that one.
Yeah.
Because it ties back to the squared semi-partial, which I like. Mm-hmm. What I really like about more general approaches is when they simplify to things that I actually understand, because it's a very short list. But what I like is my little squared semi-partial from my 5 predictor regression that I like so much, in the general dominance, that's just one of many values that could be associated with that variable. That's the one with that variable when all other variables are in the prediction equation. But as you just described, we can calculate it with 4 variables. We can recalculate it with 3 variables. We can recalculate it with 2 variables. We already have that squared semi-partial, but it's just from one of an entire set of predictor equations that we could have. And then we're just averaging over all of them. And you're kind of shrugging and saying, when we take all of these together, this is the average squared semi-partial correlation. But tell me the magical thing about those averages, because I find this appallingly cool.
It is appallingly cool. And I think it's what really sells this idea of general dominance. And that is the following. If I get this, quote, average delta R squared for variable A, and this average delta R squared for variable B, and this average delta R squared for variable C, obviously those provide a ranking, right? One of those numbers is going to be higher than the others. And we could say by the definition of general dominance that that is the most important variable. But the magic is if you add up each of those average R squareds for the variables, they sum up to your overall R squared for the entire model.
And that is freaking cool. It makes no sense at all until you start to think about it. When you define multiple R squared as the proportion of variability in the outcome that is associated with the optimal linear combination of your set of predictors, what Greg just described about pulling all those individual pieces together and taking the averages, that's exactly how it works out. I'm a huge Venn diagram fan. Think about 2 overlapping circles with a Venn diagram, and then a third one, and then a fourth one, and then a fifth one. And you're gathering those little pieces that are not overlapped by the other circles, and you add them all up. That's exactly how that works out.
Yep.
So I'm going to put that in the appallingly cool camp. So if we're talking about dominant characteristics of appallingly cool things, Lewis Hamilton is number 1. And number 2, that the average of the squared semi-partials of each variable sums to the multiple R squared of the entire regression equation. That's admittedly a distant number 2 to Lewis Hamilton.
That is to say that if you do a multiple regression, and again, we'll say with 3 predictors, and the overall R squared is let's say a 0.6, then this general dominance measure for variable A could be a 0.3, for B could be a 0.2, for predictor C could be a 0.1. Those add up to 0.6, but they also give you a sense that A is generally contributing more when it appears in all of these different constellations of regression equations and sub-regression equations, right? It is generally contributing more than B, which is generally contributing more than C. And I gotta tell you, that parsing of the R squared is just so freaking beautiful. Now I have taken into account all of the different contexts that each of these variables could appear in, and I'm saying, yeah, generally this one is explaining more than the others. And I find that incredibly useful.
And I really wish it would become part of standard output.
Yeah.
What is a typical table that we see? The raw estimate, a standard error, a critical ratio, a p-value, a standardized estimate, a squared partial, and a squared semi-partial. That's most complete.
Yep.
I think a column should be added that has some form of these dominance measures. Why don't we? We're just not used to it. Macros exist. There are packages in R.
Yep.
So one of my favorite things about this is they're really quite amenable to graphics.
Yeah.
You can put these in pie charts. You can put these in histograms. But notice we've not said boo about inferential tests.
That's correct.
That X1 is significantly more predictive than X2. We don't have inferential tests about the order of importance. And some people have done some very clever work with bootstrapping.
Yep.
It's very cool, and I'm never going to argue against a bootstrap. But quite honestly, one of the draws for me is there's not an inferential test. Mm-hmm. And it is very much a natural effect size estimate where I don't necessarily have a hankering for an inferential test.
I agree with everything that you said. You know, when someone gives me an R squared for their entire regression, they don't usually give me an R squared with a confidence interval around it. We understand that there's a confidence interval around it. We understand that this is not an R squared that is meant to represent what's going on in the population necessarily, right? It could be off one way or another. But we almost never care. There is sampling error in these dominance statistics that we could get for each of the predictors. We could get standard errors around them. We could get like bootstrap confidence intervals around them. I get that, but I'm fine with saying for this sample in these data, we found the contribution of A to be this overall. And we know other things are going to affect these too, right? In our world, measurement error is something that's going to dampen stuff. It's going to dampen our R squared. It's going to dampen our ability to say one variable contributes over another because one variable might be less reliable than another. We know that all of these things play into that. But if you just say, hey, I am in a regression scenario, and that is an appropriate scenario for the things that I'm trying to look at right now, and maybe you want to say that my variables are reasonably well measured, I find this an incredibly useful thing. In fact, of all the offerings that dominance analysis has, I'm less concerned with the complete dominance thing. I'm less concerned with the conditional dominance thing. It's the general dominance thing that I really like, and for me in the end, the selling point is this partitioning of the R squared. That to me is mwah. Wait a minute, do you like drink milk from a big cup? I don't know what happens when you win the big race. What happens?
Milk?
I don't know. There's some.
This is F1. They are drinking magnums of champagne.
Or whatever. There's some. Maybe is that horse racing where they drink?
Do you get out of the house at all? No, that's Indy.
Ever wonder why the winner of the Indianapolis 500 celebrates by drinking milk? One word: Mum.
Those are the milk drink. I'm going to have a drink of milk. No, F1 is a magnum of champagne.
The first time that champagne was on an F1 podium was in the inaugural year of 1950.
Oh, well, okay.
We're starting to head toward the exit. We could do a deeper dive, but we don't want to spend the time. For those loyal listeners out there, you know that's also a euphemism, which we couldn't do a deeper dive because we don't know it. A couple of walkaway points to consider is you made an insanely important point, and I don't think you were even aware that you had made it, and that is if the regression is the proper model. We've talked for a lot of episodes, either directly or indirectly, about how regression is a lovely starting point, but maybe isn't always the model that we are most interested in. So everything we're talking about here is based on our standard regression, but we have talked about what would motivate you to move to a path analysis model, a structural equation model, what would motivate you to move to multiple indicator latent factors. All of the limitations of Gauss-Markov apply here, and so you need to keep that in mind. At the end of the day, whether you're willing to look into the mirror next to your pinup of Lewis Hamilton and say, my name is Patrick and I want to infer cause, well, we are in not a great place to do that in these models.
True.
Everything we've talked about is a cross-sectional setting. There are alternative hypotheses. We don't have temporal precedents. So just know that this is as applied to this amazingly powerful multiple regression model. And actually, if you're a student out there somewhere, and completely unlike me, you don't have the practice sessions up for Bahrain on your phone that's propped up under the monitor right now, because that would be rude and disrespectful to you, Greg, if I'm going to be completely honest. A lot of these things could be generalized to other settings as well, and I think some really good generative work could be done to say, well, how might we do this in a latent variable setting?
There's a lot of potential here, and we just wanted to expose you all to that, at least to the extent that we could, with Patrick's attention barely engaged in the topic. Who's winning?
You don't win in practice trials for, oh my God. Anyone, especially from Europe, please throw me a bone here. We can talk about F1.
All right, F you.
And we're out.
Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go to avoid the things that should be dominating their time. You can also follow us on X, Blue Sky, or Instagram, and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, get cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks, from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized Quantitude Pod merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the official podcast of Formula One racing. If by Formula One you mean the formula B equals X prime X inverse X prime Y. This week's episode has been brought to you by racing teams who are sponsored by statistical software packages. Let's go down to the track.
Thanks, Greg. It's an absolutely gorgeous day here at the Quantitude Grand Prix. Conditions are perfect for some especially tricky data analysis. Let's see who we've got on the track. Looks like we have Team Stater. This team is known for its great expense. We know their car offers the driver different interfaces to allow for greater control, but of course it's also known to have some challenges handling some of the larger and more complex courses. And I think everyone remembers what happened last month in Monaco, when it wiped out trying to handle date formats correctly. Oof. Next we have Team SPSS. They also have some of the more expensive equipment on the circuit. We're told the car's especially easy to drive, some say too easy. But again, we're reminded of last year in Bahrain at the Bayesian Data Analysis Championships. Ooh, spectacular implosion. Team SAS is also here. As with Team Stater and SPSS, there's obviously a lot of expense in this versatile equipment, making them a robust and reliable competitor since the time of your grandfather. In fact, looking at the driver, he actually appears to be a grandfather, as does the whole crew. Well, we should be expecting a lot of pit stops today, mainly for him to get out and pee. And in the remaining position is Team R. Incredibly popular here on the circuit with the younger fan base, in part because it's the fans who helped create this vehicle. But I think everyone will remember Singapore, where Team R got the red flag when some of their parts were not working properly and others were no longer supported right in the middle of the race. And I'm looking for their pit crew. Oh wait, that's right. They're trying to use ChatGPT as their pit crew. Well, we wish them and all the teams all the best in today's Quantitude Grand Prix. Back to you, Greg.
This is most definitely not Team NPR.